Welcome to another Ideas That Matter conversation. I'm really delighted here to have a young colleague who I've interacted with at a lot of Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition conferences. So this is Usha Nathan from Louisiana State University, where she is a professor, and she's got a lot of areas of specialization that I think are going to be very helpful for people who don't know what's going on in contemporary philosophy. So we're going to talk about this term epistemic injustice and about moral emotions, but we're going to do so not from a, let's call it presentist perspective, but a much longer view, because Usha is also a specialist in Aristotle, and we've talked quite a lot about the emotions and the role that they play in Aristotle and in ancient philosophy more broadly. So welcome on, Usha, and why don't we just jump right in? I think that the term epistemic injustice, and you've also got another term that you use in a paper, hermeneutic injustice. These are topics, terminology that a lot of people see out there, but they don't have a clear idea of what they mean. So I'm not asking for a definition because those are always hard to come by, but can you characterize what these are so that people can wrap their head around them?
Yeah, so simplest way to put it is to say injustice that you suffer in your status as a knower, as someone who has some knowledge, that is, or you're in your capacity as a knower, that sort of injustice is characterized as epistemic injustice. So that's just sort of um, it sounds mysterious. So let's give an example.
Okay.
That Miranda Fricker, who coins this phrase, and she wrote the book Epistemic Injustice, where she sort of classifies it into two categories. So one is testimonial injustice, and the other one's hermeneutical injustice. The more straightforward one is testimonial, and that's just simply we can think of cases where a person is not trusted as a knower, and the classic sort of examples you can think of is antebellum um, America. The laws would not permit African Americans to give evidence, and they would not be trusted as sources of knowledge. So that's an example. And more controversial, we can say that given the rape laws that exist today, even today, women are not trusted as as knowledgeable about the incidents they suffer. So we need to, often when they give testimony about sexual violence, that case needs to be established on independent evidence,
Right.
often because their testimony, their evidence giving is not taken, it's not considered credible enough on its own. And so those kinds of injustices, and what has been interesting and why the term sort of took off, I think, is that it immediately sort of captures a very core problem which people, especially gender discrimination cases and racial injustice cases, and more broadly we can say refugees who have to prove, or asylum seekers who have to prove that they are indeed targets, say that when they're asylum seekers, that prove that they're targets, that their life is in danger. Like, you can look at all of these kinds of instances and you see, so the testimonial injustice term captures so much of what is happening, narrowly in the legal context, but you can see more broadly as a social phenomenon, that as knowers, marginalized persons tend to not be trusted in their capacities as knowers, and their evidence is not taken as credible. And so that's one of the reasons that it's spoken to a broad range of scholars, not just philosophers, but it's really pulled in, I think, a lot of attention from a lot of people working on these areas, in legal theory and law, but also in other areas where these kinds of issues are studied. And so testimonial injustice, which is a kind of, in fact, maybe the most obvious and more prominent kind of epistemic injustice, it has really, I think, connected with scholars in a lot of fields. Hermeneutical injustice is less studied, I would say, and it sounds also, because of the multi-syllable word there, a little bit more scary. But
Okay.
I think, to me, it's more fascinating in some ways because it's a very subtle phenomenon, which is much more likely to be missed. So hermeneutical injustice, Fricker has a very nice way of characterizing it. She calls it the kind of injustice where a person has a part of their experience that is sort of indescribable or unnamed. Unnamed is sort of the official idea. Unnamed, for reasons having to do with, again, the threat it poses to power relations, their position. It has to do with their position in society. So in my paper for Ergo, I look at the case that Fricker looks at is the term sexual harassment, which for a long time was not coined. In fact, it's so recent that it's almost shocking that the word didn't exist before the post-feminism, first wave
Right.
feminism. So she talks about the evolution of that term, and she talks about one particular case in we have to be careful. It's not as if it was not prevalent, right? That's so one of the things I do in my paper is I look at a case, maybe a really archaic example of that kind of harassment. I look at a play in Aeschylus, which is, in fact, it's pre-classical. So the phenomenon has been around. Ovid's talked a ton about it, right? Ovid's Metamorphoses is full of instances of harassment, if you think about it. But the term has only been coined very recently. And so Fricker talks about a case of specifically about a case of a woman in Cornell who was working in a lab of a famous scientist who was, making sexual advances towards her again and again, and up to a point where she was, forced to take the stairs to avoid him having to take the elevator with him, started suffering all kinds of physical problems, back pain and all sorts of things because of all the, extra things that she had to do just to maneuver to safety. And so she finally quits her job, but suddenly when she's like, she goes to file for unemployment, there's a problem there because the term doesn't exist. She's unable to say, and she has to write down personal reasons. And of course, that doesn't qualify her, right? And so that's a problem. And what then happens, I mean, Fricker tells the story in a very linear way. I think concepts don't evolve quite in that way.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it's a nice narrative because it's kind of tells like going from not knowing to knowing. It's a nice story. So let's suppose this is how it happened. And so what happens is at that time there's consciousness raising groups that are being run by feminists in and around Ithaca. And one of the women, Lynn Farley, invites her to come to a meeting that she's having where other women are present and narrate her experience. And there is she comes in and she tells what she had been going through at work, and there's an aha moment. Every woman in the room recognizes what she's talking about. They don't have a name for it, but they all know what she's talking about. I mean, I'm a little bit of an exaggeration to say all, but most of them in the room have familiarity with that phenomenon. So then that becomes the point at which the the women start, Lynn Farley and other women who are present, the feminists start talking and discussing among themselves, and in an effort to sort of, I think it's an article for New York Times, they are forced to sort of coin a term for it because they have to say what it is. And so they come up with, after discussion among themselves, they say, well, we want to talk about sexual harassment. And then, so that's the term is coined because there's a sense that it's happening, something's happening, and that can be described. Different women are experiencing it, can it described with a single term, and but we're missing the term. So it has to be coined and sort of brought into existence. Then, of course, it's years before the laws catch up, and then we have sexual harassment regulations and laws being put into place. So but for all of that to happen, a name needs to be given to this phenomenon, which is an experience for these women, which
Yeah.
until that point is indescribable in some ways. Because
It's interesting because in many cases it would be not described, or from the vantage point of that culture, that time, indescribable. But it strikes me that one of the struggles is also getting it not misdescribed, right? So if we take sexual harassment, for example, the common response in the past, and unfortunately still in the present, is, well, boys will be boys, right? Which is a write-off saying, this is just the way it is. You could substitute other linguistic expressions like, this is just the nature of business. And so getting people to say, no, that's a misdescription. Here's a better description of what's actually happening. This is the appropriate one.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's the part of it that's fascinating to me, right? So I think what you're talking about as misdescription is that before the term is coined, it's not recognized as normative, right? So
Right,
it's
right.
not recognized as a wrong. It exists. Women talk about it, and then as you said, it's sort of brushed off the carpet as not significant,
I,
and not
I
significant morally, not significant normatively, not something that needs to be done anything about. So
yeah.
that's one of the shifts that happens, right? So I think um, so sexual harassment is tricky for that reason. But I'm really interested in these kinds of what I call moral wrongs, which are missing from the vocabulary, so to speak. So I'm interested in sort of maybe a subset of these hermeneutical cases. You could argue that all of them have a moral dimension. It might be the case that they at least have a normative dimension. The other case that Fricke mentions is postpartum depression.
Right,
That's a
right. Yeah.
medical term, not so much moral, but before that, it's just sort of this vague phenomenon surrounding motherhood, which you can blame the uterus hysteria or whatever, and up until the medical community sort of recognize it as a distinct phenomena and name it, it exists in this very um, it exists in a way. Again, we could say it's again misdescribed, right? It could be described as, oh, she's having, this is a hormonal reaction, or this is some, or whatever way of, sort of dismissing it and sort of writing it off. It's unclear that all concepts are moral, but there's the normative dimension. There's something's wrong, right?
Yeah.
Some kind of deviation has occurred, something, it's an actual case of a disorder. And so yeah, postpartum depression is the other one that she mentions. In my paper, I talk about forced marriage as a missing term in Greek, in the ancient Greek context, because if you look, for different cultures, the idea of female agency, it doesn't have to wait for feminism. It's not waiting in the 19th century. That there's different at various times ideas of female agency arise as sort of resistance to the phenomenon. And one of them is, I think, that in a lot of cultures back then, now we're talking classical period, pre-classical even, where marriage is described as a transaction between two families, and it's only the permission, so to speak, of the father. This is also perhaps in some instances in the Old Testament, where it's she moves, and some of the old rape laws to talk about it in this way, like she's the property of the father and then she's the property of the husband,
right?
And so she's not seen as an agent. So in the Greek context, the play that Aeschylus writes, it's called The Suppliants. It's very, very old, but it wasn't one of the trilogies that was awarded the Dionysia Festival. We lost the other two, but it's supposed to be the first in the trilogy. There are lots of unusual features about it, which makes the play very, very contemporarily fascinating. Beyond the issue of forced marriage, I think. Very briefly, it's these 100 women arrive. They are royal women from a family in Egypt. They have arrived at the shores of a Greek kingdom, and they want the king to. They're seeking asylum. That's how we would describe it in modern terms. But they're also claiming that they have a kind of ancient claim to the Greek land, that because they have an ancestral connection to Greece through mythology, and they claim that this woman Io, who was in Argos many years ago, was sort of targeted, picked by Zeus, and Hera, between the quarrel between Hera and Zeus, she's turned into a cow and she's chased out of her lands, and she wanders. She becomes sort of a refugee in modern terms, and she wanders away, and then later she goes and settles in Egypt. And so they claim to be descendants of someone who was originally from that land. So that's the only sort of, but there's so many other interesting aspects. This is one of the few plays in tragedies in existing where there's a chorus as a protagonist. One of the few ones where it's a chorus of women and their protagonists. They are also visibly very unlike Greeks, which the king says, well, you seem to be from Ethiopia or some faraway land like India. So they are visibly foreigners. So it's a chorus of foreign women as protagonists. So it's a very fascinating play for those reasons as well. And it's striking because a lot of the play is very stagnant. It's mostly an exchange, right? The women have sort of a leader. Their father is present who advises them on how to speak to the king, but the women are, make their case directly to the king. The father doesn't speak for them. Again, Aeschylus has done an interesting move there. And then the women speak to the king, and there's a range of question and answer back and forth. It's almost like an assembly. But it's happening on the shores of Argos. And they're trying to convince the king to, please. And the king says eventually, you know what? I can't make the decision here. I need to take this to the assembly. But so he deflects his responsibility. But the entire play, the bulk of the play is the women are engaged in a dialectic, where back and forth with the king, trying to persuade him to take up their case and to speak up on their behalf at the assembly. They don't have a voice in the assembly, but the king can speak for them. So how I connected to epistemic injustice is they have this trouble of speaking like, something's being done, we need protection, this is wrong. And the king is obviously, because there's no reason, right? He keeps challenging them, saying, what are you saying? Did they do something wrong according to the laws of your country? No.
Yeah.
Did they do something wrong according to the land of Argos? No. So what is the wrong there? And there's no, so it's unclear, right? So they keep saying a decay, right? So they are saying, or hubris. The term they use is hubris, but they're
Okay.
asking for justice. They're asking for decay. They're asking for justice, but the king is unable to see what the injustice is. And so that's because women saying no to their marriage is unheard of. And so that's the situation where they are forced to communicate something for which the term doesn't exist. The wrong is not recognized as a wrong. Um, and
Yeah.
so the persuasion then is sort of, I describe it as a kind of first preliminary attempt at arriving at some kind of communicative term, before, it's much later that it becomes, it's nowhere near as clear as the Lynn Farley sexual harassment case, because there's no term coined. But the shift that happens in the play is that the king is able to see the reasons, and he's able to understand it as a wrong, and he speaks in language very strikingly similar to the language that, so the end of the play gets a little dramatic. The king goes away, asks them to like stand inside the a temple there, and it's a sacred space. They're protected. Zeus is protected. Ironically, Zeus is a protector of outsiders.
Right. Yeah.
So right, so their women are asked to stand inside the temple, and the king goes away. And at that time, the cousins of these women who are pursuing them reach the shores, and there's a very visceral moment where they're about to be dragged out and taken away, and the king comes and he like stops them and says like, look, you can't take them away, and this is why. And there we finally see that they have reached, communication has succeeded. He has reached a point of some kind of transition of understanding that no, you can't do this, and this is wrong, and in fact my citizens have agreed to protect these women. So the play ends with like the women being taken in, and because the king goes and obtains the permission of the assembly and comes back and just in time to save the women. So to me, what's fascinating about the play is that the main action of the play is rhetorical. It's going from, hey, something wrong's happening to me, I need someone to protect me, you are the king, give me justice. And the king saying, yes, I think what is happening to you is injustice. So
an interesting segue that'll sort of broaden this. Another play that comes to mind where the chorus is in fact a protagonist is another by Aeschylus, the Eumenides, right? Because the Furies are the chorus, and so here's the transition. So your paper is actually titled Moral Emotions and Unnamed Wrongs, Revisiting Epistemic Injustice. The Furies are anger or vengeance personified, you could say. And anger is one of these moral emotions that we hear about. And you've got a very nice analysis in there about Aristotle and the emotions. Now, anger is one of those emotions that some philosophers think, oh, it's always bad. Actually, some religious traditions too, certain Christians, you can see this in a lot of Buddhist interpretations. Just don't do it. But Aristotle says that we have to watch it. Don't automatically think that getting angry is going to solve anything, but it could serve some useful purpose. So what are these moral emotions? And in your paper you say that moral emotions can they can help us realize that there's an epistemic injustice taking place. How does that actually work?
Thank you. So moral emotions is a term I borrow from contemporary philosophy. With Aristotle and the Greeks, it's fascinating. all emotions for Aristotle are moral. We don't have to spend too much time thinking about it, but it's because of the way they think about fear, which is often the case of a non-moral emotion for us.
Yeah.
But even that is sort of considered like there's a kind of moral danger. Life is morally important. And so the way Aristotle conceives of it, all of the emotions have some kind of moral normative content. But but as contemporary philosophers see it, and I think our way of thinking about emotions, at least some of our emotions are moral emotions, in the sense that they have normative content. They have to do with recognizing, or recognizing is too strong a word. I use awareness
Okay. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
something wrong has occurred. And that's where often the negative emotions come in. So this ties in with your question. So not all of them are, not all moral emotions are negative, but many of them are, right?
Yeah.
So anger is a very prominent case. Now, the way the Greeks think about anger, which is sort of very close to how Aristotle thinks about anger. This is, I'm thinking about, the work of David Constant on Greeks and more on emotions. So, so Aristotle is more or less with the common sense there, with the Greek sense of anger, which is that it's a sort of response to a slight. That's a very interesting way that he describes it. It's a response to and interestingly, he says undeserved slight.
Right.
Undeserved slight done to you or one of your own. And here the your own, here's that's also interesting, is that it's not just a personal thing, it's also something where your brother or your immediate family or one of your close friends are really important for Aristotle, is insulted. You can be angry because it's as if it's happened to your extended self. It's
Right.
so
Right. Yeah.
anger is a very personal emotion. So a lot of things that we call anger, like being angry for what is happening to children in Gaza, for instance, those kinds of cases, Aristotle wouldn't really call them anger. So those are cases we describe as anger. That might be, it's hard to say exactly what they would be. They would be sort of like, not exactly nemesis, but something like indignation. Nemesis is
Right.
translated as indignation. It's it's somewhere between what Aristotle calls anger and what Aristotle and the Greeks call nemesis or indignation. So those kinds of cases are not even anger for Aristotle. So the anger is a very personal emotion, but it is tied to this normative notion because it has to do with an undeserved slight. So for Aristotle, it's important. It's an important way of standing up for yourself. And so in
And
his
those that you
discussion,
care about as well.
yeah, those that you care about. So it's easy for him, because it is described as this undeserved slight, and it has to do with one's social standing. A slight is when you're treated in an inferior way by a peer or someone lower or someone higher. But it has, again, this is interesting for the Greeks, that all the Greek emotions have a very strong social aspect to them. Even anger does. And anger, it has to do with it, how someone's treating you and how they should be treating you. We think of that as just moral, but for the Greeks, it's also social. And so Aristotle's, it's an easy step from there to say, well, if you don't show sufficient anger, or you don't show anger in the situations where where it is appropriate to show anger, you're in fact not responding appropriately. That's a lack. That's a lack of virtue.
Right.
And that's a failure. That's that shows. And if those kinds of cases are in fact most people would agree those are, that you have failed to respond appropriately in those situations. That's the way that for Aristotle, anger becomes an appropriate emotion, and where the slight is undeserved and so on.
Right,
And
right.
so where the response is, as Aristotelian scholars would say, where anger is called for, you should exhibit anger. Now, where it gets a little bit hard, and this is where I think people have the religious tradition and a lot of other traditions depart from Aristotle, is that Aristotle recognizes that part of anger is a mixed emotion for Aristotle. There's a kind of pain, right? You're being
Right,
slighted,
right.
you're being treated badly. That part is painful. But Aristotle says there's also an anticipation of revenge that's pleasant.
Very pleasant
Yeah.
in his view.
And,
Yeah.
uh, uh, Aristotle is happy to admit it. And,
Yeah, yeah.
it's not to say that he's condoning the pursuit of that revenge. It's just he's recognizing what a natural sort of aspect of anger is, that you are also anticipating that future revenge, which is an anticipatory pleasure. You're imagining getting back at this guy, which
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
and for Aristotle, that part is unproblematic, which we might disagree about. He um, uh, doesn't sort
Well,
of treat.
don't you think that like getting angry in the right way at the right time with the right person, all these sort of provisos that go into the anger being virtuous, being part of praotes or good temper, mildness. Doesn't that give us kind of a check on it? Now, people get mixed up about it, and there's the possibility of like lying to yourself and
Yeah.
your friends and saying, "Oh, I'm totally justified," and me keying this person's car or spray painting something on their door that's the right way to handle these sorts of things, right? People can get mixed up about that, but then Aristotle would come along and be like, "Come on, buddy, you know that's
Yeah.
not the right sort
Yeah.
of thing to do."
Yeah. I think, yeah, those are definitely sort of the cases are much more restricted. So he wouldn't,
Okay.
our common, you can have an angry response, whether or not it's appropriate. So Aristotle has, in another paper that is under review, I talk more about Aristotle has very strict sort of dimensions of each emotion, that
Right, right.
to have the appropriate response is not just in this moment anger is called for and you have the angry response. No, Aristotle further wants to say it should be directed at the right person or situation. It has to be of the appropriate intensity. So, if you're someone who's like, someone shoves you and you're like, you get murderous angry,
Yeah, yeah.
obviously off, right? I'm exaggerating, but Aristotle is very, very, careful about saying like the response should be appropriate, proportional, or not proportional, but of the appropriate intensity. It should be held for the right amount of time. So
Right.
and Aristotle interestingly talks about all the various ways in which you can go wrong. So you can be just as someone who's like, who tends to hang on to anger too much. This is just a bitter tempered person. That's a
Right,
way of
right.
like getting your anger. It's like your disposition for anger is by itself is vicious, right? Like you're disposed to be too angry, or you're disposed to be sorry, you're disposed to be angry for too long for
Right.
things, even if those things are appropriate to be angry about. If you're angry for too long, that's a way of failing to have the appropriate response.
So to add another wrinkle to this and come back to the idea of epistemic injustice and moral emotions being ways that we can maybe like breach that whatever resistance there is. So imagine a situation where you've got a person who's in a higher up position, a person who's in a lower up position. We'll just say it's in the workplace, right? So and we'll take race and gender and all that out of it. It's just a pure
Yeah.
power relation, and the boss is doing things that are should make a person angry. They're doing it in terms of epistemic injustice. They want to do a policy. The employee says that's going to negatively impact us, and here's how it's going to affect us. And the boss says, "Well, what would you know? You're not in charge. You don't have an MBA. Pick whatever excuse you want." And then the employee gets angry as a result, rightly so, I would say. And let's say that they're actually, they're exhibiting it in the right way instead of like going and kicking the boss's door in and knocking everything off their desk like they
Yeah.
do in the movies. They write a strongly worded memo, and it goes to the boss, and the boss is, like, well, your anger is inappropriate in this case. I'm sending you to HR because of this. You have anger problems. So, who gets to decide the measures, we could say, for the right amount of intensity over the right thing expressed in the right way? It's not epistemic injustice at that point, although epistemic injustice was let's say, the cause of that. But it's another kind of injustice for me, if I'm the boss, to dismiss the employee, or it could be teacher and student, to
Yeah.
dismiss their reaction as, oh, you don't know, you're an
Mm.
uncultivated person, you're vicious or something like that. I think that's what, now if we transpose that into race, class, gender, ability, pick whatever else we want, where there are structural inequalities like that, I think we see that a lot, right?
Yeah.
Where women get angry over, the fact that people aren't taking sexual harassment seriously, and then they're talked about as being shrill or hysterical, or pick a, whatever list of
Yeah.
terms you like, right?
Yeah. Uh, um, that's a phenomenon that's more people are talking about it now. It's a kind of affective oppression. I,
Okay.
that's not the term in the literature, but that's how I would describe it. It's like there's a kind
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
so the norms, I think what we are talking about here is that there are certain unfair norms that uh, that curtail the expression, especially of negative emotions, of persons in marginalized position, right?
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
And they are sort of self-policing themselves, and often, you know, that's a kind of injustice on its own. And on a picture of so the merit of Aristotle's picture is that we can make sense of that, because at the and here I'll come to a worry that you have shared with me about Aristotle's views about women in a moment. So
Okay, yeah.
there is this, in the discussion of virtues, at least Aristotle is not um, differentiating the virtues of a man, um, um, depending on economic class, right? So there's no, that anger is inappropriate. I think he would, though, say that, given his views about slavery, that there are certain emotions that are inappropriate for. So Aristotle's picture would become restrictive there. But
Hmm.
here's where I think here's where things are interesting for me with Aristotle is that I think the um, his his views are in tension with each other. That's the way in which I understand him. There
Okay.
are people who think, and here uh, Mariska Lewson, at North Carolina Chapel Hill, she has worked on Aristotle's biology. She has a read on Aristotle's ethics as, assuming already from the get-go that this is only for a certain class of ethic, you know, of men
Yeah.
in Greek society. I think that's a way of making him consistent with his biological views, with his views in the politics. But I read Aristotle as inconsistent. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think, to
And
be fair,
underdetermined, you could say, right?
underdetermined. And I
Yeah.
think there is a genuine incoherence. And I think there's similar issues with his epistemology. You can try to render it consistent. And I think there we are not doing him justice by doing that and not seeing his own intellectual sort of pitfalls. But parts where certain of his intellectual aspirations get the better of him.
Yeah.
And then he fails to recognize that they don't conform to his very parochial views about women, slavery, and so on. So that's how I read him. In his ethics, for instance, right? So there are moments of like genuine, I think, insight where he's not, at least in the ethics, he's not very concerned about, is this applicable to every culture? Are we talking about non-Greeks also? Are we talking about, but why does he not do that? So either you could say, and this is where I and Mariska disagrees, either you could say he's presupposing he's only talking to Greek noble,
Right.
uh, the Greek well-born gentleman, or you could say that he thinks that these are just the right ethical views, and these are the view, this is his, not that he is necessarily coming up with an ethical theory. I don't think the ethics yields a single theory as a whole, but he is trying to get it right. I think that's the way I read him. So his ethics, I think, stands in tension with his politics, as I
Yeah.
see it. And so, but there is the problem, given how he thinks about the minds. So he thinks his biological views are that
Right.
women are incapable of practical wisdom. Slaves are incapable. Natural slaves are incapable of practical wisdom. So they will lack virtues, right? So they'll
Yeah.
not have full virtue because full virtue requires practical wisdom. So they cannot have full virtue. That's the view we get very much in the politics. And
And the rhetoric, I would say too, where he
yeah, in the
says
rhetoric,
most people are bad,
most people are bad. Yeah, the rhetoric, and there are further challenges. Some people think it may not even be his philosophical theory.
Yeah.
There's some more controversies with how to read his rhetoric than there is with his ethics.
Yeah.
So there's that problem. But I think what the ethical theory is, if as I'm thinking, it truly aspires to, at least to get it right, it applies to everyone. If that's the case, then his theories are in tension. And but I think that's where interestingly it yields some of these you can sort of use Aristotle to criticize Aristotle, so to speak. Um,
Yes, that's a great way
uh,
to put it, I think. Yeah.
yeah. So that's how I try to make sense of that. But there's I haven't addressed everything in your question, but I think
Well,
that's part of the idea behind.
I find that interpretation, that approach to it very attractive because it makes Aristotle no longer into the superhuman sage that we all have to listen to. And, he's like the rest of us. We're kind of a mess of contradictions. If I look back at my own works, they don't all add up in relation to each other. And the more that I write, probably the more that's the case. But I want to bring up another question because I want to be, cognizant of your time. So this has to do with moral emotions, and it has to do with the standpoint. So I can talk about my own moral emotions, revealing to me that an epistemic injustice is taking place. You think about younger people being dismissed by older people, for example, right?
Yes,
And the same thing happens now with older people. I'm getting to experience this the older I get, older people being dismissed by younger people.
younger people.
Um, but I think that in a lot of cases, it wouldn't be so much that I have the moral emotion, but rather I perceive another person having the moral emotion as being a sign that there's something wrong. So we've talked about anger and you mentioned fear. So let's say we take refugees or anybody else who's in a very vulnerable position, they have very few resources, and I see them being interrogated by a police officer, and the fear that they have is palpable. You can sense it, in the air, so to speak, and you're like, wow, something's happening here. And you see the police officer being oppressive and dismissive towards them, or it could be a bureaucrat, or pick whoever you want, and you're like, oh wow, there's something wrong here. I can't put my finger on it, but I know there's something that that is happening because of the emotional reaction of the other person. And it could be anger. And I was wondering, well, what other moral emotions could, maybe sadness, grief, that a person feels, where you're like, oh man, I don't know what's going on, but I know there's something substantive here. I need to identify what this is, or at least touch on the surface so that I can do justice to this other person in relation to whoever is causing them, to
Yeah.
feel this.
Yeah. So there's a couple things I want to say about it. First thing I want to say, which relates to your earlier question, and this is where I challenge Fricker's account,
Mm,
and others have done it too. And the problem with Fricker's account is that there's a kind of too clean, a kind of like one step, you go from not knowing and there's a term, it's over. But I think often what happens is that there's a like, usually there's multiple stages, and there's also some, it's not something that is, it's either up to the person's suffering the situation, or
yeah,
it's like, or they have to like wait for some big change to happen. For it's not those kinds of, it's not top down. It is sort of bottom up, but also it's not
okay,
that simple. And so often it is up to the victims to somehow recognize something is wrong. And what happens is, as you are describing, um, there are third parties who are sympathetic,
right,
onlookers, who are, they are not in the same situation as the victims, as the king in the story. They're not in the same situation as the victims, and they are not in for any reason sympathetic to the aggressors or the oppressors. So they may be in a position of relative privilege, but what is interesting is that there is a sense of, and this is what I talk about in the paper, is that there's a sense in which they understand from our broad and sort of what we might even call an intuitive sense of justice. I call that, there's a kind of preconceptual, just there's a sense almost of injustice that people pick up
okay,
on. So that kind of sense allows sympathetic third parties to recognize, just as you're describing, when you witness someone being questioned, say by a person at the border, or somebody being questioned by the police, you
yeah,
can recognize, you can feel that something is wrong. So that I think, that's that those people play a crucial role, and they can often be, sort of appealed to. So they, so one of the problems that Fricker raises, and this goes back to something you mentioned, right? So the problem often people mention is that how can the marginalized person communicate, right? Because they are often not allowed to express their emotions.
right.
How can they communicate what they feel at a very affective level? That anger, or this visceral sense of wrong, or shame. Often victims of
Mm,
sexual harassment feel shame. So how do they communicate that thing that's happening to them? So, and what I talk about in the paper is that, one, rhetoric is a kind of, it's an old idea, coming from the Greek tradition. It's a bad word now, but if you think about it, purposeful use of language, right?
yeah,
Which, like writers do with when they use description, thick description, evocative description in novels and so on, fiction. That kind of use of language can actually be used as a tool, as a to communicate. So that's one of the things that we see happening in the plays, that they use mythology, they use analogy to communicate their situation to the king, right? The king is familiar with the myth of Io. He understands something, terribly wrong happened to this poor woman turned into a cow and made to wander the earth, right? So they're tapping into that knowledge and that familiarity, and they are using an analogy to draw him in and to communicate that, like, hey, look, you see that something really terrible happened to her, we are wandering like her. We are wandering away from, we are being forced to leave our land, and we are come
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
So they can communicate that. So one, it's rhetoric, and the other is that you don't need sexual harassment. All you need there is a way of eliciting the sense of wrong that the king has. There's this broader notions of justice and fairness that we all have from from being part of society, and just navigating life, pick up that notion of fair sense of fairness and justice, which allows us to recognize that it's a wrong. It doesn't have a name. It's still a wrong. So there's already progress there. And that's the kind of thing that is interesting to me. So I think you're right. But the other thing I wanted to say about it was that there's here's something that I do think, here I'm going well beyond Aristotle, I think. But what I sort of learned from Audre Lorde and reading James Baldwin, who I'm a big fan of, both his prose and fiction, is that there is, and feminists have a way of making sense of it. They talk about how is it that the victim experiences the wrong and recognizes the wrong before the oppressor does, right? So there's a sense of like asymmetry there, right?
Okay, yeah.
There's an asymmetry there. And early feminist epistemology, they talk about, because the oppressed is in a position of constantly being, in a situation of, as you described, they're vulnerable to harm. So they often are, and Baldwin would describe it in this way, in a situation where they have more knowledge of their oppressor than the oppressor themselves.
Right, right.
And so they are very aware of their actions. I often anticipate their responses. It's a situation of being vulnerable. So it is as a kind of survival mechanism, you might call it. But the Baldwin talks about this as a kind of very immediate sense that you get of like, oh yeah, before other people sense the wrong, they can sense, this is wrong. And that, I think, is a product of that vulnerability. And that's what we learned from Lorde. Audre Lorde, actually use her in the paper because she gives,
I saw it, yeah.
Yeah, it's a retrospective description of her as a 5-year-old when she, for the first time, comes face to face with racial hate. And she's, we have to be cautious about like how well you remember what you remember as of your experience as a 5-year-old. But there's to me, what was fascinating was there's a small detail in it which captures beautifully. Again, there's an analogy. The girl is on a subway in Harlem, and she gets in, and a lady gets in a very fancy coat, and this 5-year-old little Audre Lorde is a little 5-year-old, and so far she has never hasn't encountered hate of racial hate. And so she's sitting next to this woman, and this woman sort of pulling herself away from her, like trying to take her coat away from her. And immediately her response is there a cockroach here? The child looks to see, oh, is there something here that is causing her to have, it's a kind of reaction, almost like there's a pest, something you want to get, that kind of aversion that this woman is exhibiting, that the child picks up. But the only aspect of it that she's able to pick up. It was later that she recognizes that
what it was actually being exhibited.
That's her.
Yeah.
She's feeling the aversion towards her, not, there's no insect. It's her that she's feeling the aversion for. And and of course, Lorde is constructing a kind of narrative where she says there are other instances where she sees that, when she goes to a chemist or something, there's another incident in a shop, and she sees like same thing in that person's eyes, so she can. What is interesting to me is that, and I'm unclear if let's first instance, grant that there's at least this, there's some kind of probable sort of evolution of a concept. And we would think, what are like concepts are difficult to describe. A lot of models now exist for what is a concept. So we don't have to worry about any of that. But at the very least, right, we think someone has a concept and they can pick out the things, instances of it, right? So if I don't have the concept of a cup, I'd call it, I don't know,
A
um,
bowl.
the bowl with my coffee in it or something, right? So, and if you asked me to go get a cup, I wouldn't know because I didn't know what is a
Yeah.
cup in the kitchen. So if you know how to pick it out, that's a first maybe indication or very basic. It may not be sufficient for saying I have a concept, but that's one of the steps. So um so when the child recognizes, I call it like her picking up like an aspect of racial hate when she notices the aversion, and then she makes the connection that it's not the roach, it's her, right? So she's picked out something, and when she's able to see other instances of it, that's her
Yeah.
able to, it's almost exhibiting like a preconcept. I call it a preconceptual awareness because most people wouldn't say that's enough for a concept, but there's a kind of awareness. So that's all it takes, is to be able to identify an aspect of something. And then if you're able to see the same thing happen in a few instances, then you're, the way it relates to Aristotle, and in some ways, for me, all of this in some ways comes out of Aristotle's theory of moral learning, because Aristotle says um, we develop responses before we acquire concepts. So
Right.
so, before knowing why something is right or being able to give the reason why something is right, we learn to identify that that's the right thing to do, right? Like if there's someone being,
It feels right.
it
Or
feels
feels right.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, if someone's like beating, if you're, kindergarten, a kid is, you see a kid getting beaten, you have nothing to do with the kid. It's not a friend, nothing. But you immediately say, hey, don't do that. Right. So it's not like maybe the child
Yeah.
have a reason. And now we have people who are working in developmental psychology who are, working on, I think then we can say there's like some kind of moral concept and not just like, it's wrong because it's unacceptable in our society. So there's a
Right.
distinction there, but they're now slowly starting to see that there is this distinct sense that even toddlers have evolve a kind of ability to say something is wrong or respond to it as a wrong
Right.
before they
Yeah.
can give the reasons for it. Reasons come later, and that's an Aristotelian insight. I think that's why he says is habituation comes first. So being able to sort of sense that it's the wrong thing, and then being able to respond in that way, that just saying that is a first response, and then doing something about it, stopping it. So those things come first, and then we get a deeper moral understanding on the picture. So if you think about it, all I'm saying is that take the Aristotle picture, right? And if you think about it, there's a lot that we don't know, and we can't really say that our moral learning is complete at any stage.
Oh yeah. Right.
And so we might think that we continue to learn in that way, same way that Aristotle thinks habituation occurs at various stages in our life. And it somehow takes that kind of slow path from response to reasoning and reflective understanding. Something like that path has to happen, even for the other, even for adults. And so that's why, so we can walk around and see unnamed wrongs just happen to be there. I don't have a theory about that.
Not yet, at least.
Yeah, Philip Kitcher does. Um,
Yeah.
about how societies evolve into better societies and so
Well,
on.
that raises a very interesting thing, which maybe we'll conclude
Yeah,
with. So you are what they often call young career academic, right? You're fairly recently out of graduate school. You've got a position. You're exploring in very competent ways that I like quite a bit. I think important topics, but if we think about, you said you don't have a theory for this. Maybe 20 years from now you do, right? Because these sorts of things aren't the types of matters that, it jumps out of our head like Athena coming out of the head of Zeus. It takes a long, long time for us to put all the different pieces together and sort them through and figure them out. So actually, let me ask you this, sort of jumping off of that. You've got interesting matters that you're digging into using the resources of both contemporary and ancient philosophy, and also doing comparative work. Um, is there something on the horizon for you that you haven't really worked out yet, but you're really puzzled by and do want to start digging into more? I won't call it a research program, because a research program is sort of like pre-concept and concept, as you were talking about. A
Yeah.
research program, you've got it all worked out. You can submit it for grants and tell people about it. Do you have some inchoate thing that you feel is really important that you want to work on more?
Um, a funny thing is I have been, so someone recently did ask me, because I have something that I'm working on Aristotle, which is sounds a lot different from all the things that I'm working on and puzzles
Okay.
people. But I've been trying to see, so, the way I think about it is that we pursue these puzzles which capture us, the connections between them emerge slowly. But I'm
Right.
trying to see them. So let me put it in this way. The connection, recently I was listening to George Saunders at an interview, and he has a nice way of putting this puzzle, which to me it really he calls it. So he was describing his writing process, and he was saying, writers are often asked, like, what is the method? How do you come up with it? Like, what
Yeah.
is, and you could ask that same thing of philosophers. I don't think there is a linear, neat process from idea to paper. It's often much more messy. And so he was saying to me, let's say, like he says, like it's very difficult because but he put it as a puzzle. He said this should be puzzling to us, that I can work on something like a story which has like a million moving parts, right? And it's like a Rubik's cube. It's like a very big Rubik's cube puzzle. And every small change that I make, right, there are a million possibilities. Again, I could have done it, did a different thing, the story would have gone different
Yeah.
directions. So
Yeah.
many million pieces. And then he says, but I'm making these decisions. Not all of them are conscious. So he calls it, the puzzle is that it seems like our, he says, like, for a lack of a better word, the unconscious is capable of this massive amount of complexity. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
to me, that's an completely untouched phenomenon. I wouldn't call it untouched. It's being touched by Freud in bad ways. I won't say all bad, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
unconscious gets a bad rap. But the way I call it, and it connects to how I think about emotions, is that there's this unsaid, unsayable, or as yet inarticulate
Mm.
understandings. And to me, I'm encountering that. The first place I think I talk about it is where with the emotion stuff. But that's a broader phenomenon and doesn't just have to do with art, as Saunders describes it. It seems like something to do with creativity. Yes, it's a puzzle also of creativity, but I think there's something fascinating about the human mind that um, philosophers overlook. I'm fascinated by it
Yeah.
because it's such a widespread phenomenon, and at least for me, because I'm fascinated with literature and art, it comes to me as primarily as an art puzzle. But is there an ethics in emotion stuff? I'm seeing it in theories of racial justice, how people came to consciousness, and evolution. If you see of important concepts in racial justice are happening in that
Mhm.
way, where this unspoken, un, it's either pre-verbal or it's maybe non-conceptual or a-conceptual. I don't know what it is, but there seems to be this almost like beneath the tip of the iceberg, this entire phenomenon of complexity that the human mind is capable of. Uh, that is, I think, my primary puzzle is coming at it. I think right now I'm trying to come at it I'm still coming at it from concept, like trying to
Okay.
understand it in terms of concept.
Yeah.
But I'm also constantly trying to think about it from the creativity perspective. But I think I'm coming at it in different ways. But the phenomenon, and I couldn't find a better way than Saunders to describe it. It seems like um, we are capable. It's not just our conscious mind, it's us, the part of it that is below our understanding, below our reflective understanding, is capable of massive levels of complexity. And that uh, is fascinating to me, and something that I want to, try to
Yeah.
kind of develop some way of talking about it and come at it in different ways. I think that's what I'm working on. I don't think it's the puzzle for a lifetime, or I don't know. I don't want to call it to be like,
You're not going
there
to write
may
a
be,
whole sequence of books
yeah,
with, a
no,
quadrilogy or something about it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But it seemed like I'm coming at it now in a different way, but I'm still thinking essentially about that.
Yeah.
That
I think this is a great whatever you want to call it, problem issue set of topics to be fascinated by. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this has been a delight. Thanks so much for coming on. I think that a lot of the things that we've ranged over will be very helpful for the people who watch or listen to this. So I'll include links to all of the relevant things, your position, the paper that we referenced, and anything else that you'd like in the video.